Hello. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key concepts from Chapter 2 on what is a theory and how do you do research, and also tie in a couple of the theories that we learned in Chapter 1. So this is Chapter 2, which is the beginning of Module 3 on theory and research. So this is an example that I use in my face-to-face classes, which I think helps set this up. Let's say you're walking through a parking lot and you see a friend and you yell, "Hey, friend," and the friend ignores you. In your head, you're probably thinking, why did that person ignore me? Well, when you're trying to figure out why, you're formulating different kinds of theories. You think, oh, maybe she's mad at me, or maybe she was daydreaming, or maybe the car next to her was so noisy that she couldn't hear me. These are all different possible theories that you use in that example to try and figure out why your friend is ignoring you. Well, one of these might be right, or maybe all three of these theories are actually wrong, and your friend has headphones on and can't hear you because she's listening to her music. What you've just done there is created three different theories, and then you ended up doing a little observational test, and then you found out that your theories were actually wrong. Your friend's not mad at you, she just can't hear you. So a theory is a way of binding together a multitude of facts so that one may comprehend and explain them all at once. So in that example, you were thinking about my relationship with this friend of mine. What did I do? Why is she mad at me? Oh, look, there's all these cars here. You have all these different inputs coming into your head. You're perceiving them, which is something in Chapter 3 we'll talk about, and your perceptions may or not be accurate. A theory enables us to make reasonably precise predictions about the future, or it allows us to describe phenomena and explain phenomena, things that are not actually predictive. And every academic every academic field has theories. Think about all the theories you learned in your other classes. You've learned lots of theories in science classes. You learned theories in art history classes. You learn theories in every communication class. This class is obviously called communication theory, so that's what we'll be focusing on. But every single class you've taken in college has taught you some sort of a theory, and then you have the right, to believe or not believe that theory on your own. In your everyday life, you use lots of theories. You have theories about what is the fastest way to drive to work. And if it's 9 in the morning, do you go one way? If it's the middle of the day, maybe you go another way. You avoid the freeways during rush hour. All of those are theories that you use to help make your life decisions. So as I just said, theories do basically two different things. They can describe or they can predict. The first is a descriptive function of a theory. And sometimes people call this the explanatory. So descriptive, explanatory, I use both of those terms back and forth. A descriptive theory tries to explain and understand some phenomena. So in communication, you might explain and understand why some small groups are more effective than others. You might describe or explain how communication happens, which is what actually was included in Chapter 1. Chapter 1 had three different descriptive theories that tried to describe the communication process. And so for the next couple of slides, I'm going to run through those just as a way to illustrate descriptive theories that you've already learned in this class in the last chapter. The first is the linear model of communication. And this is the first model of communication from, almost 100 years ago now, 80 years ago or so. And it was a pretty simple line. It said that communication has a sender, and then a message that goes through the channel, and then a receiver. You can see it's called the linear model because it's a 1, 2, 3 line. It describes how communication happens. Now, an important thing about theories is that you often start with a foundational theory, and then with research and thought and work, you build on it, and additions get made to that theory to make it more complete. And that's what's happened in communication. So the field starts with this simple linear model, 1, 2, 3. And then it moves to a more interactive model. And all of this material is in Chapter 1 on pages 12 and 13 and 14. The interactive model builds on it, and you can see it makes a circle, which it adds in the concept of feedback, which is an important communication term. There's an encoder and a decoder. So the encoder sends the message, and then the decoder receives the message, and it loops around interactively. You can see that this theory is an improvement on the linear theory because it's actually more realistic. Communication doesn't usually just go one way. Usually there's some sort of a cycle that happens. The next variation, subpoint C, is the transactional model. And the transactional model just builds on the cycle that we just saw. And it tries to capture how dynamic, if something is dynamic, it is constantly changing. Like a dynamic, anything that's dynamic changes a lot. So a dynamic relationship is one that from day to day may be very different. And the transactional model also shows that time makes a difference on this. Your communication with one person today may not be the same as your communication with that one person next week, because communicator A and B have different contexts. They have different experiences. They have different backgrounds. And all of these things impact into the transaction that happens when there's communication. So you can see it's actually not that different than the circular, but it brings into the fact that the first person has a field of experience, has background, has experience on whatever the subject is. Person B also has that, and that all gets brought into the model. It also includes noise, which is in the transactional, which is in the circle model as well, the interactive model. Noise is something that helps break down the system. All right, so all three of those are theories that try to describe how communication happens, which is the first function of theory. A descriptive theory explains and understands why, those are the examples I had on the earlier slide. It tries to describe and explain why communication happens, or how, right? Descriptive is how and why. The predictive function, some theories go a step farther and try to predict things that will happen in the future. So if I take this medicine every day, will it make me feel better? That's a predictive question where a predictive theory would be used. It would say, yes, taking this medicine every day will make you feel better. And you could test that by having somebody take the actual medicine and somebody else taking a placebo and see if there was a change. So predictive functions are when you change a variable. The question then is, what is the outcome that happens? One person gets this medicine, then the next day they get this other medicine. Does that make a difference in the outcome? And many theories start as descriptive and then become predictive. They can be one or the other. There's not one that's better. And sometimes they interact together if you're researching something. Some of your theories that you use every day just try to explain action, and some may predict things in the future. So how is a theory created? Well, you observe something happening. You observe some phenomenon. And then when it happens again and again, people start to develop explanations. So a theory is created over time. It's a process, and it can definitely change. Theories are not the same thing as laws. They're a point of view. I may have a theory about why somebody does something, and you may have a very different theory about why that person does that. That's why communication is so interesting. People have different points of view. Theories evolve over time, as you just saw from the three communication models. They evolve, they add in different parts. Theories are selective in that they select what they try to cover. Theory of communication does not cover, I don't know, gravity, for example, because they cover different things. And theories may contradict. This happens all the time. Someone has a theory about how the human genome works. Somebody has a different theory. You do research, and over time, you may decide which one is a stronger theory. So in probably, I don't know, 5th or 6th grade, you learned the basic scientific method. And that's exactly what we're talking about in this class, where you're thinking about a question and you're coming up with a hypothesis. Your hypothesis is the theory you're trying to prove. My theory is, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't finish my example. My theory is that the president speaks to the public and is always standing in front of a American flag. So that's my theory. That's what I want to try to prove, is that the president speaks in front of a flag. And that's over here. I'm sorry, I didn't finish off that example. Um, and that's what I would then try to figure out. And I would use different kinds of research to see if the president's always talking in front of a flag. That would be a pretty simple thing. I could look at all of the speeches that the president has given and count simply to see the frequency of how many times he speaks in front of a flag. I might then take that piece of evidence and go back and ask another question. I might ask the why. Why do I think the president always does that? And then I could come up with a hypothesis and then do more research, and then the circle keeps going. Now, it's important to realize that communication research is done through a lot of different methods. This says conduct an experiment, and an experiment is where you would have the medicine example I was giving before, where one person takes one medicine and another person doesn't take it. That's an experiment. There are lots of different ways of researching communication and researching in all the social sciences and in the hard sciences too. So it's a cycle and it keeps going, and you come up with what theory or hypothesis you have, and then you see if you have evidence that helps substantiate that theory. This next little thing, I'm going to talk about a few different research methods that get used in communication. I'm going to bring the slide back one. So if you look at this, I'm going to talk about step 3. What kind of research would you do to try to prove your theory? There are different ways that you may do your research. There are qualitative research methods. These are described in chapter 2, and one of the assignments for the groups this week is to do more research on this. So I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but we'll talk a lot more about this over the course of the week. Qualitative research may be done through textual analysis, and that probably is what I'd be doing if I was looking at pictures of the president giving a speech. Those pictures would be my texts, and I would be doing an analysis of what is in those pictures. You can do an ethnography, which is where you get into a culture and study a culture. Sometimes you might do participant observation. I did a project on that in college that was really fun, where I went to truck stops and hung out with truckers and wrote about that culture that gets created at truck stops. So that was an example of an ethnography that I did as a project in college. You can also do historical research, and this is obviously done in lots of different fields, where you may research the history of presidential debates or the differences between this presidential debate and that presidential debate. These kind of blur together because you'd be analyzing the text, but you'd be doing that historically. You also can do quantitative research in communication, and a lot of people in the field do this, where you may do frequency counts, counting how many times somebody stands in front of the flag. You may conduct surveys, or you may do experiments. There are communication experiments where maybe I send a message by text messaging, and I send that same message by email, and then I look and see what the outcomes are from using different kinds of communication media. So a lot of the field does quantitative research. If you're into that, there is certainly a place for you in the field. The third and fourth kinds of research that happen in communication are critical research and rhetorical criticism. Critical research, as described in the book, identifies and challenges that which oppresses, marginalizes, or harms. And this may be more theoretical. You're not running an experiment here, but maybe you want to do critical research about, I don't know, immigration in America. And you analyze the history of that, and then may make arguments about, in your paper, in your presentation, about systems that might oppress immigrants that we have. There are lots of different things you can do there. Rhetorical criticism is where you look at a text. You might look at a speech, you might look at a paper, you might look at a photograph, and you analyze that piece of rhetoric as to whether or not it was effective. Now, I want to say that these 4 different categories are not separate, and sometimes people will do research to try to prove a theory that uses a bunch of different things. You could do an ethnography and a historical analysis. you could do a critical piece as well as do some qualitative or quantitative.